Hello out there in virtual world. I am Ashley Spivey. I am with Ivy Black Girl, and we are excited to talk with you all tonight around race-based and gender discrimination through natural hair. So as y'all will come on, I'll give you a second, and then we are going to get started. So while we wait for folks to join us, let me give you a little bit of background about Ivy Black Girl before we bring on our keynote speaker, Dr. Wendy Green, who we are super excited to have back. As y'all remember, she was on our roundtable event that we did around LB 451. And so we were like, we love her so much and she's so brilliant. Why not bring her back to give us more information? So as a reminder, Ivy Black Girl is a collective that exists to create space for Black women, femmes, and girls to access and reach our full potential. We do that through four approaches. So that is through collective giving and investments, through creating spaces of affirmation and abundance, through thinking about economic liberation and entrepreneurship, and then through collective coalition building and advocacy. And so our work around the legislative bill LB 451, which it expands natural hair protection in the workplace, is an important part of that work from a policy perspective and our coalition and organizing perspective. And so tonight we will have Dr. Wendy Green really ground us on the history of why this kind of legislation is important and what that looks like for the state of Nebraska. So I am excited to introduce her. She is the daughter of an American civil rights activist and is a trailblazing U.S. anti-discrimination law scholar, teacher, and advocate who has devoted her professional life's work to advancing racial, color, and gender equity in the workplaces and beyond. So like I said, she is an expert and we're excited to have her. Dr. Green's legal scholarship and public advocacy have generated civil rights protections for victims of discrimination throughout the United States. Through her award-winning publications and activism, Professor Green crafted a legal blueprint for historic civil rights legislation known as the Crown Acts, which has also shaped the enforcement stance of the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, or EEOC, for federal courts, and administrative law judges, as well as civil and human rights organizations in race discrimination cases, challenging discrimination African descendants suffer when donning natural hairstyles. So her work, again, is creating ripples across the US and globally. Teen Vogue, Now This News, and BCC World News have celebrated Professor Green for her pioneering role in increasing public awareness around, as well as securing legal redress for what she has coined as grooming codes discrimination. She has testified on legislation. She is still putting out publications and is the founder of Free the Hair Movement, um, which really looks at, again, how can we create space for and advance protections in the workplace, specifically for Black women and folks with a natural hair texture. She is the first tenured African American woman law professor at Drexel University Klein School of Law and is currently writing her first book, Free the Hair, Locking Black Hair to Civil Rights Movements, through the University of California, Berkeley Press. So I'm super excited to bring in my friend and colleague, Dr. Wendy Green. How are you?
Hi, Ashley. How are you? I'm
I
great.
am good. And I'm super excited that you're here and we'll turn it over to you. So all of the folks out there, please utilize the chat. We are watching it. We will have a keynote address from Dr. Green for about 20 minutes and then we will open up for Q&A. So get your questions going, have your pen and paper because she's going to drop some knowledge and make y'all think. So with that, Dr. Green, I will turn it over to you.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Ashley. So we'll go ahead and get started here. Let's see if this will, there we go. I hope everybody can see that. So essentially the keynote presentation for this evening is about civil rights law and advocacy. What's hair got to do with it? And let's see, oh, why is it not advancing? Just one second. I don't know, actually, Ashley, if it's advancing on my end. That's weird.
No, I can see your screen, but it's not. Do you want me to pull up
Oh,
your address
actually,
and advance it?
oh, I see it. Can you guys see that again? Sorry.
So we can see your main screen. Try to go to the next slide.
To the next slide. I think I was hitting the wrong.
Yep, now we can see it.
Okay, I was hitting the wrong screen.
Uh,
Okay, thanks for bearing with me and figuring this out. So again, the keynote lecture is about civil rights law and advocacy. What's hair got to do with it? Many of us are probably familiar with the 1964 Civil Rights Act, which prohibits various forms of discrimination in the employment sector, in public accommodations, as well as in institutions that are federally funded. With respect to Title VII of the 1964 Civil Rights Act, it is a federal law, again, that prohibits race discrimination, specifically in our workplaces. It also prohibits discrimination on the basis of national origin, religion, color, sex, and sex. And so shortly after the 1964 Civil Rights Act was enacted, we started to see individuals of African descent really publicly talking about the kinds of discrimination that they were encountering in their workplaces on the basis of their natural hairstyles. And to be clear, this kind of discrimination really is not anything new. It didn't start in the 1960s. Frankly, since the eras of racial slavery and racial apartheid in this country, as well as abroad, racial discrimination and subordination on the basis of African descendants' natural hair texture has existed and persisted. However, we start to see during the height of the Black Power movement slash civil rights movement, more individuals of African descent rocking their natural hair texture in afros and braids and twists, among other types of hairstyles. And they start to openly and publicly talk about the kind of discrimination that they were experiencing in a number of spaces, but specifically in the workplace. And Deborah Winwig is one of those individuals. And her hair story is that, like so many women as well as men of African descent, was placed on suspension and then ultimately fired because she refused to change her afro. According to United Airlines, Ms. Renwick's afro did not comply with the company's quote unquote short hair look. Then fast forward, we see more cases in the 1970s and the 1980s being reported. And in particular, in 1981, we see some really high profile cases. And this is one of those of San Francisco news reporter Dorothy Reed, who was suspended from her employment for wearing cornrows and locks. According to Ms. Reed, the television station's grooming policy that banned locks and braids constituted racial discrimination and denied her the right to express her heritage through her hairstyle. Fortunately for Miss Reed, she was reinstated with full back pay, and she was told that she could continue to wear her cornrow hairdo. However, many Black women have not been as fortunate as Miss Reed. Black women around the world donning natural as well as protective hairstyles are not only losing employment opportunities that for which they are qualified, but they are also being called dehumanizing racial epithets as it relates to their hair when they are wearing natural hairstyles, and stigmatized as unkempt, disheveled, unprofessional, aberrant, radical, militant, unruly, distracting, wrong, extreme, unusual, unattractive, and unacceptable. And these kinds of stigmatizations really are the result of both conscious and unconscious biases and stereotypes that are associated with our natural hairstyles, and they manifest themselves in our workplaces as well as other spaces. And to be clear, this kind of discrimination is not limited to African descendant women, African descendant men, such as Kerryon Washington, who was told that his locks constituted an extreme hairstyle and was denied a job at Six Flags for wearing them. And additionally, it's not only limited to adults, African descendant children are also being expelled and disciplined at high rates because of their natural hairstyles. But as it relates to African descendant women and girls, there really is something that is very unique and acute about about the consequences of this discrimination. And what I've argued in my work is that, African descendant women, men, boys, and girls are suffering heightened levels of scrutiny, discipline, harassment, and policing of their hair in schools, workplaces, and throughout broader society, which ultimately communicates to me is that that many actors are engaging what I call the hyperregulation of African descendants' bodies through the medium of our hair. In the case of Black women and girls, what often is the case when we see natural hair discrimination or natural hair bans is that in effect is imposing what I call a straight hair mandate or expectation that they must satisfy to prevent the denial or deprivation of educational and employment opportunities, as well as to prevent the kind of discrimination and stigmatization that is occurring when they are wearing natural hairstyles. And so one of the things that many people are not aware of, in addition to the kind of stigmatization that African descendant women are facing in our workplaces, additionally, sometimes you have very explicit mandates that Black women have, as a condition of employment, have to chemically straighten their hair or have to straighten their hair through maybe extreme heat styling as a condition of employment. And one of those examples happened in the UK a few years ago, where a Black woman who was applying for a job at Harrods department store was explicitly told that she had to chemically straighten her hair in order to get the job. Also, as you can see here, Jessica Powell, a commenter on, I believe this was on Facebook, she was also told by her employer that she had to keep wearing wigs at work because they didn't want to accept her natural hair. And in particular, she was told that she continued to wear a wig or that she could lose her job because her natural hair was deemed distracting. Additionally, as it relates to these invisible burdens that Black women are often encountering as it relates to their hair, the Perception Institute's Good Hair Study has found that 1 in 5 Black women feel social pressure to straighten their hair for work, which is 2 times as many as white women. Black women also experience higher levels of anxiety about their hair than white women. And Black women report spending 9 times more money on professional hairstyling and hair products, as well as spending more time on their hair. And they also spend more time with professional hairstyling appointments than white women. Additionally, Black women and girls are often enduring what I call invisible harms of race-based natural hair discrimination when they're having to conform to straight hair expectations, pressures, or mandates. For example, oftentimes people are unaware that in order to achieve a straightened hairstyle, that many of us will engage in really toxic chemicals to straighten our hair or extreme heat styling through pressing combs, as well as other types of heating agents. And we often suffer chemical burns from these chemical relaxants that then end up engendering hair loss. Additionally, we see higher rates of hair loss that Black women are experiencing, not only due to chemical straightening agents, but also extreme heat styling, as well as wigs and weaves. And we are suffering, different, really at higher rates, certain types of dermatological consequences, like different forms of alopecia. Additionally, when we are losing our hair, obviously that heightens some emotional distress, as well as us having to use, our financial resources to repair this harm, both physical and emotional. Additionally, as it relates to these invisible harms, the Good Hair Study essentially reaffirms what many of us may know, at least anecdotally, that Black women, when we are straightening our hair or spending a lot of time and energy and money in order to achieve straightened hairstyles, that we often disengage in exercise and other physical activities because of our hair. Another study indicates that Black women who were surveyed are more likely to commit to professional hairstyling than going to a physician. Additionally, there has been research that demonstrates a potential link between reproductive health implications and the kinds of products that we're using to maintain our straightened hairstyles. There may even be a possible link as it relates to higher rates of uterine fibroids, uterine cancer, hormonal infertility, and more aggressive forms of breast cancer amongst Black women, as well as increased hormonal activity amongst Black girls. And so all of these things are what I, again, call these invisible harms that Black women and girls often suffer when we are trying to or are feeling the need to conform to straight hair expectations, pressures, and mandates. And so essentially, Black women are having to endure physiological, psychological, financial, as well as physical consequences. And so often what I say as we talk about natural hair discrimination is that if you care about Black women and girls' health, then you have to care about our hair. And so how the law comes into play here, or civil rights law in particular, is that, back to Title VII of the 1964 Civil Rights Act that prohibits workplace discrimination on the basis of race and sex, is that often when Black women as well as men are challenging natural hair discrimination in their workplaces under Title VII as a form of race discrimination, they are met with a lack of success. And so this is just one example where a federal judge recently ruled that a petition that was circulated around a Black woman's employment and that actually had her coworkers, signing on to this petition if they felt that her natural hairstyles were unprofessional. The judge in that case found that it was offensive, but it did not amount to unlawful race discrimination. Additionally, in more recent cases, and frankly, this marks the 40th year that we have a reinforcement of lack of protection under federal law as it relates to race-based natural hair discrimination. And the most recent case is EEOC versus Catastrophe Management Solutions that involved Chastity Jones here. And she, as you can see, was wearing blonde curly locks during her interview for a customer service position with the company. She was extended the job offer, and then ultimately that job offer was rescinded because they claimed that even though at the time of her interview her hair was not messy, but they perceived it as having a unique propensity to become messy in the future. And additionally, they were banning natural hairstyles like locks in accordance with a neutral grooming policy that barred extreme and unprofessional hairstyles. So ultimately what the court does, this federal court does in this case, is that they declare that, again, this was an intentional race discrimination case that arose under Title VII of the 1964 Civil Rights Act. And so the court basically reaffirmed nearly 40 years of legal precedent that declared that discrimination on the basis of a Black hair texture, like an afro, is prohibited by Title VII. However, adverse action on the basis of a Black hairstyle, like locks, does not. Because the court perceived Black hairstyles like locks, braids, and twists as a mutable cultural choice, as opposed to an immutable or unchangeable characteristic. And so ultimately what that means is that under federal law, if an employer discriminates on the basis of an afro, then that amounts to unlawful race discrimination. However, if you lock, braid, or twist that afro and you're discriminated against on those grounds, then it's no longer magically no longer race discrimination, and therefore employers are free to regulate and discriminate against individuals on the basis of what courts have deemed mutable cultural characteristics, like our hairstyles, except for afros. And so what I have argued in my work is that race is not limited to immutable or unchangeable characteristics, arguably like our skin color, but rather when we think about race, it is a social construct. And race discrimination is often animated by these characteristics that are associated with racial and or ethnic identity, like our skin complexion, our hair texture, our hair color, hairstyles, the widths of our noses and lips, our eye shapes, even down to our accents, our speech, our residence, and our names, and also our clothing as well. These have all been associated with race and also have communicated or expressed our racial and cultural identity and have served as a basis of discrimination. And these are just some additional examples beyond the hair context and also inclusive of the hair context, where individuals have been discriminated against, and Black workers have been, in particular, Black women have been discriminated against on the basis of donning blonde hair, like myself. We've had individuals who have been discriminated against on the basis of their names, as well as their use of a foreign language. And in those cases, federal courts have often declared, again, under this immutability doctrine, that that type of discrimination, or these types of discrimination, do not amount to unlawful race discrimination, because hair color or your name, or your accent or your language, those are all things that the courts have deemed to be mutable cultural characteristics. So what I've argued in my work is that lawmakers, when we are enforcing our civil rights protections against race discrimination, really should be treating race as what it is, that it is so much more than immutable or unchangeable characteristics, that race includes physical appearances and behaviors that society has historically and even contemporarily commonly associate with a particular racial group. And this definition has been quoted in that EEOC versus Catastrophe Management Solutions case, as well as endorsed by the Ninth Circuit as a viable definition of race for constitutional purposes. And iterations of this definition of race have also been included in legislation that we know as the Crown Acts. For, as you can see here, in the first Crown Act that was passed in California, it defines race in civil rights protections as traits historically associated with race, including but not limited to hair texture and protective hairstyles, and goes on to define protective hairstyles as inclusive but not limited to hairstyles such as braids, locks, and twists. Since California adopted the Crown Act, we've had several other states to do the same: Virginia, New York, Colorado, Washington State, New Jersey, Maryland, and most recently, Connecticut. And here we are in Nebraska. In Nebraska, as you already know, as Ashley has mentioned, that Senator Terrell McKinney has introduced LB 451 this legislative session, which would provide the following clarifying definition of race in the Nebraska Fair Employment Practices Act, which is: race is inclusive of characteristics such as skin color, hair texture, and protective hairstyles. And protective hairstyles would include hairstyles such as braids, locks, and twists. Additionally, LB 451 does something also very important, which it really helps to enumerate employers' obligations when, for bona fide safety or health reasons, they may have to regulate characteristics associated with race, like our hairstyles, for example, or possibly our clothing. And these are just some of the things that the employer would have to demonstrate in order to not be held liable under the Nebraska Fair Employment Practices Act. So in sum, what this legislation really does, it helps to provide a clarifying definition of race, which is typically not included in our federal civil rights protections. It also raises public awareness around the global discrimination that African descendants suffer on the basis of our natural hairstyles, as well as the economic, psychological, physiological, and physical harms of this discrimination. And frankly, it has helped to raise people's confidence about rocking their natural hair freely. It also really helps to provide a legal recourse for individuals who encounter race-based natural hair discrimination in all of its forms. And then additionally, it helps individuals to really reflect. It provides a really important educational function for us to really reflect on our conscious as well as unconscious biases and stereotypes associated with our natural hair texture. And then lastly, I'll say that this legislation helps to really reform. It helps to reform our minds so that it can really lead to changed behaviors and treatment of people who may wear their hair naturally. And in turn, it helps to dismantle what we know as texturism, which is a color and race-based hierarchy that has assigned higher value or sometimes being called good hair if you have straightened hair or the propensity to have loosely curled hair, and alternatively bad hair when you have hair that is curly or coily or locked. And ultimately, in reforming our laws and our policies and our minds, my hope is that this legislation and all of the public awareness that comes along with this legislation will bring us to a point where we could all declare all hair is good hair.
Thank you so much, Dr. Green. I so appreciate you and just the way in which that you can, one, break down concepts that are super heavy, right, and are a lot, and really make sure that we are learning and being able to engage in this work. So we do have a couple questions in the chat. We'll get to those. So folks, keep dropping in your questions. But I wanted just to kind of ask you and start out our Q&A of like, what made you dive into this kind of work? Like, right, like you could have picked a lot of different areas to explore and to build your portfolio of work, but why here?
Why natural hair discrimination? Well, I'll have to tell you, the seed was planted really early in terms of really trying to combat various forms of racial discrimination, and specifically discrimination affecting African descendants, not only in this country, but around the world. So at a very early age, I felt very inspired to actually, hopefully one day, really serve as a social justice advocate, a civil rights advocate, to try to dismantle racial discrimination that Black people were suffering, specifically in the workplaces, but also in other spaces. And then what happened is that as I was in law school, I uncovered these cases, these federal civil rights cases that produce what I consider to be a hair-splitting legal distinction. And so I really just felt even further sort of incensed by this hair splitting legal distinction that really made no sense to me and basically perpetuated long-standing forms of racial discrimination and inequity and barriers to employment opportunities for which we were qualified for. And I really wanted to produce scholarship that could hopefully bring about viable legal interventions to actually cure this unnecessary gap in civil rights protections. And since then, I just built a body of work, several publications around what I call grooming codes discrimination, specifically as it relates to the kinds of discrimination people of color suffer when we have these discriminatory enforcement of grooming policies in our workplaces. And so, yeah, that's pretty much the short story is that, since I was 5 years old, that seed was planted to really try to be an advocate for racial justice and equity. And this is just one part of that quest.
Thank you. A lot of what IB Black Girl, really kind of our origin story, is centered around us feeling the leadership kind of feeling really exhausted, right, in these spaces in which we work, right, that perpetuate white supremacy culture of how we have to look, talk, act, right? And so it's really exciting for us to be a part of this kind of legislation here, and then to really engage you from a national standpoint of what's happening, not only in the field in which you work, but like around the country, in these different geographic footprints on how folks are addressing this type of discrimination. Mm-hmm. So one of the questions, which I think kind of leads into this, is from C. Renee. Let me get my mouse together. And they ask, is anyone working on adding this protective language to civil rights legislation? So maybe can you talk about how you see this legislation showing up at the state level and even federal now?
Oh, sure. So I did not include, for the sake of time, because I could talk about this for an hour or more, or if you let me.
I
So
feel like a day. I feel like we could be like all day. You would have us doing case studies and getting it all together. Like you would get it. You would have us working.
well, I'll have to tell you, I have 6 students who are actually doing this work right now. Is that what you're talking about? For my legislative practicum at Drexel, that is totally centered around not only the Crown Act, but other types of legal reforms like LB 451, as well as enforcement guidance that is being issued by various justice departments, as well as other civil and human rights enforcement agencies. And so, as it relates to the federal bill, I did have the privilege of co-drafting the federal Crown Act that was introduced in 2019 and then passed by the United States House of Representatives in last year in September of 2020. And so, the plans are for it to be reintroduced in both houses of Congress, or both chambers of Congress. And according to according to that legislation, what it would do is provide another clarifying definition of race, which currently reads that race and national origin, actually, to be clear, race and national origin, where race and national origin would consist of characteristics that are commonly associated with race or ethnic identity. And if it is passed, then that definition, that understanding of race, would be the understanding of race that judges, as well as other bodies that are enforcing our federal civil rights laws that prohibit race discrimination, that would be the definition of race that they would be using when doing so. And that federal legislation would actually extend to not only the workplace, but also to educational institutions and other institutions that are federally funded, as well as public accommodations and housing. So yes, there is work happening on the federal level. There's work happening again on multiple state levels. Last legislative session, almost half of the states introduced that legislation, but as you know, due to COVID, that much of legislation period just got squashed. So a lot of states have reintroduced this legislation, and additionally, we've seen important movement on municipal levels too. So we have 17 municipalities that have passed this kind of legislation within the past year and a half. And then lastly, we've had important guidance coming out of major cities like New York City, with the New York City Commission on Human Rights, that has their enforcement guidance has recently been codified. It declares that natural hair discrimination is race discrimination, and also when they're enforcing their laws, that's how they're going to treat it.
Thank you for that. And folks are giving you affirmations in the chat, so they're excited for this work, and even like tying hair and overall health and some of the things that you named in your presentation. And so when you think about like doing this work, it can be really exhausting, right? Like fighting for civil rights and having to not only be in these spaces advocating, but also like you are a Black woman, right? So you are just out in the world navigating that as well. What excites you about your job? Like what brings you joy and is like the place where you feel like, okay, I'm gonna go here within my work to get rejuvenated so I can go back out there?
Okay, what do I do to do that?
Or like what piece of your job gives you that, right? Like what piece of the work gives you that kind of joy?
Oh, there's so many. I am very fortunate to say there's so many aspects of the work that I do that bring me joy each and every day. Working with you, working with people like you, and I say that very honestly.
I know, and it has been a joy. Like y'all don't, for the folks that are watching, Dr. Green is amazing. She is responsive. She is brilliant. Like I just be texting her like, "Hey, girl," like. But it is cool to be able to work across, like in different spaces and having different points of view and then be able to come together to advocate on this. So I would agree with that.
Yes, yes. And so as you can tell, I love it. I love working on the legislation. I love thinking through these issues. It keeps my mind hopefully sharp. Being able to work out these issues with you all. I love it so much. As you can see, you can text me at midnight and I'm going to
and you will respond.
because I'm like, oh, this is an issue, this is a problem, or this is something to think about. And I love working through these issues. And because, I do appreciate how this legislation, and even if it's not passed, but even the conversations surrounding this legislation really are impacting people on the ground every single day, whether it be someone, feeling that they can rock their hair more freely without the fear of, retribution or some type of punishment, or being able to respond more affirmatively when they are suffering that kind of stigmatization or discrimination. I get great joy when I get, notes from students from middle school, literally from middle school to high school to college, saying, hey, I came across your work. Can I have a little interview with you about it? I want to do a presentation for my school, or I would like to bring you to the school to talk about it. I just love being able to educate people on these issues and the impacts of the discrimination, but also ways in which we can prevent it and redress it, so that hopefully everyone will be able to freely rock their hair as they so choose or according to their desires, but also to be, included in spaces more equally, and feel true belonging, and feel truly not only feel but be treated as the human being they should be treated. Being treated in a dignified manner.
Right.
So all of these different things are things that inspire me every single day, and give me great joy. Even though, as you mentioned, it is exhausting because when you love something, anytime you love something and you're passionate about something, it's easy to overdo it. It's easy to sometimes not create certain boundaries so that you can have some time to yourself. But I'm trying to do better about that, that balancing act. But I will say the good days absolutely outweigh the exhausting days, or sometimes the more burdensome days of activism.
Absolutely. And so with this work, like you mentioned, Dr. Green is involved in a ton of other legislation happening at different levels of government. But here in Nebraska, our legislation is targeted at the state level. So in our unicameral, the bill is LB 451. Terrell McKinney and his team are amazing. The senator has brought forth this refined legislation and language around how we expand natural hair protections. We're clarifying race. And I'm really excited that now it is out of committee. So now it has 3 rounds on the floor for debate and voting, and then hopefully the next to the governor's desk and then signed into legislation. So if you're thinking about how do you get involved in Nebraska, you can absolutely visit our webpage. I will drop that link in the chat, but it's ibblackgirl.com. If you go under our Take Action tab, we have an Expand Natural Hair Protections in the Workplace. It has a whole page of information, a fact sheet about LB 451. We are currently advocating for folks to put comments online so that you can talk about and your support or however you feel about the legislation and what we're talking about. So all of the senators can see it. And we're also asking folks to contact their senators. And we've been using the hashtag Free the Hair, which is a movement created by you, Dr. Green. So if you could maybe tell us about the Free the Hair movement, what are you hoping to achieve, and why you started it?
Sure. So the Free the Hair movement really is a very organic product of the legal scholarship and the publications, the research and the writing and the public engagement around this issue, literally around the world for now, almost goodness, for almost this is going on year 15 or 16. Is that right? Yeah, the time has gone by, but I think that's helpful just in terms of context, in terms of trying to really, try to chip away at this kind of discrimination, right? This is something that has been going on for centuries. This kind of race-based natural hair discrimination, among other forms of racial discrimination. And as it relates to legal scholars being engaged in this work, at least at first, the first time we see it in 1991 with the seminal work of Professor Paulette Caldwell at NYU. And so really, I look at it as in some ways, I'm not even some ways, I'm very much building off of her work, that really was challenging the discrimination, the outcome of the discrimination case from 1981, Rogers versus American Airlines. And so again, building that body of work around grooming coast discrimination, in particular race-based natural hair discrimination. And so the movement really is just an organic result of me just to continue to try to chip away at this systemic, longstanding issue. And ultimately, what I'm hoping and what I see has been done by engaging the public literally around the world on this issue is that it increases public awareness as it relates to the systemic and global nature of race-based natural hair discrimination affecting African descendants, as well as the consequences. Additionally, trying to dismantle what I mentioned before, texturism, which to me is just texturism and its sibling colorism. As well, within and even beyond the African descendant community. Additionally, trying to reduce the kind of hyperregulation or policing of Black people's bodies and the negative consequences of that kind of regulation. And then ultimately, through all of the different types of ways where I'm engaging, various actors and constituencies, is to really bring about not only legal and policy change and social change, but really personal change, individual change, so that African descendants around the world can freely rock our natural hair as we so choose, and to freely just rock our hair as we desire, and may be required to do so for a variety of reasons. So that's ultimately what the hashtag Free the Hair movement is really all about.
Which I think is yeah, which I mean, right, like aligns to the work of Ivy Black Girl. But what I hope all Black women and like you said, African descendants can experience that freeness, right, and that liberation.
Mm-hmm.
So we have a question from our friend Keisha. Hey, Keisha, girl. So Keisha is a natural hair enthusiast, and she does a lot of sharing of our information for Ivy Black Girl. She's one of our influencers, and we so appreciate her work and her awareness that she brings to natural hair in that journey. And she asks, how can we as Black women not constantly feel so confined or attached to our hair? Come on, Keisha, now. We don't have a lot of time for this kind of question. Especially if you have one of those days where you get in one of those zones where we feel like our beauty is tied to our hair, even though this is not true, but it's what we have been taught to feel now that our hair isn't lovable, beautiful, etc. So I can maybe start, and then Dr. Green,
Sure.
You give your thoughts. So I remember, so I've been natural, I would say maybe 12 years. Okay. So I went from doing the big chop to just wearing my natural hair to then different protective styles, braids, twists, and then locking my hair. And I've been locked for, I think, 3 years. I can't remember. I feel like COVID in that year has warped my sense of time. But I remember doing that big chop. And I remember I felt so ugly. I felt so ugly. When I first did my big chop, my hair was relaxed, and the difference of cutting out that chemical and not putting the chemical in my hair anymore, which I can tell got into my skin, my face broke out really bad. And I didn't, in my mind, I had this idea, like that texturism conversation that you had, of how my curls were supposed to look, how to use products. The natural hair movement where I wasn't as big. So I feel like I didn't have a lot of resources or support groups like there are now to around like how to process that and unpack it. And it really was like a journey of what does being a Black woman with my hair mean to me, and what beauty or not do I see in it. and wanting like long curls, straight hair. Like, so it really was a place where I felt like I had to decolonize my mind
Mhm. Mhm.
about my hair and really embrace like this is what this is going to look like today, and that's okay. Or I don't have to put on a full face of makeup because my hair is so short now. Like, it's all of these things. And I think for me, it really made me hyper aware of how I was internalizing racism and patriarchy
Mhm.
into who I was, even though
Mhm.
I advocate against those types of systems of oppression, but it was like seeping into who I was,
Mhm.
and showing up. And so I think it's hard. And I think just you even raising that question, Keisha, is a good point of like us being reflective of
Mhm.
what this looks like and naming it so we can address it and
Mhm.
then not feel confined to our hair.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Keisha, thank you for the question as well. I have to agree with you. I mean, I feel as if I had a somewhat different reaction. But similar. It was different, but also the same. I remember, feeling maybe less attractive when I had my relaxed hair and the new growth was coming in. Right, like,
Mm.
that used to drive me crazy. And I think much of that was because you have two different textures of hair going on, but then B, not really like fully appreciating that natural hair texture, right?
Mhm.
And so it took me, literally what I call an abusive relationship with my hair. It took many years for me to really realize that my hair couldn't take, extreme heat or the chemical relaxants. Like, it would grow, but then it would break off. And so those are moments where I'm not feeling very attractive or beautiful when
Mhm.
my hair is falling out. So I think for me, it was somewhat different in the sense that once I did decide to go natural and I started rocking, various natural and protective hairstyles, for me, that actually, I feel like it really helped me to get away from some of that anxiety and some of the feelings of not being beautiful or attractive that I was experiencing with straightened hair,
Mhm.
or chemical relaxants, namely. But to your point about, I've gone through, so many different types of hairstyles, or I've had it short, like really, really short to now wearing, protective hairstyles like this. And it is a journey, I think, just period. When we're, even if it's not about natural hair, I think just even when we cut
Mhm.
our hair, right? Because again, of the association of attractiveness and beauty with long hair,
Mhm.
and having to really address that. Like, why am I feeling less attractive when my hair is short or when I have to cut it? Why is that so tragic for me? And really, just having to get that out of my head, where it doesn't matter, like, if I have hair or not. Frankly, the beauty doesn't come from, it's not external; it comes from within. And that is going to be expressed regardless of what your hair looks like. And that is something
Absolutely.
that I've had to fully and truly accept. But I think that comes also with time and maturity. But we hope that, young girls will get there much earlier than possibly we have.
Yeah, for sure. And Candy Jones is on our advisory committee for Ivy Black Girl and is one of our Curl Crew members. And she did an interview around LB 451, and it was great. And I wish she was here. Maybe she was listening. If so, comment, Candy. But she, in her interview, she said, like, I switch my hair every week. Like, so I'm not saying if it you can wear wigs, relaxers, like braids, whatever you want to wear, that is your choice. It's really about when we are feeling the constraint that we have to, that we're put in these binary spaces, that if we don't do our hair like this, we're seen as less professional, or if we don't do our hair like this, we're not seen, in the way in which we want to show up. And
Mhm.
so I hope everyone can take that away from this conversation. You wear your hair how you want, girl. Do what you need to do,
Absolutely.
whatever that looks like. And also, we are not going to let folks dictate what that looks like for us based on these ideas that are rooted in racism and sexism. So,
Absolutely. I couldn't have said it better.
yes.
That's what
So, is there anything? So, we are at time.
Already?
And yes, I'm telling you, these go so quick. So we listen, like we could talk about this all day. I love hearing Dr. Green. You are just brilliant and such a trailblazer in this space. And I feel like Nebraska is really fortunate to work with you. And I'm really fortunate. I've learned so much under your guidance in your purview. And so what do you want to leave us with? Like, I mean, again, folks are in the chat like, yes, girl, they are on board with what we're saying. They have those experiences of their own that they're talking about. So how do you want to leave us in this space? If there's one thing that, we should be taking away or really thinking about tonight from your amazing keynote, what would that be?
Well, I would just have to just quote one of my civil rights icons, one of the pioneers that I look up to in so many ways. And unfortunately, not a lot of people know about is Polly Murray, who really was the pioneer as it relates to the architect, the legal architect for the desegregation strategy that what the NAACP Legal Defense Fund under the auspices of Justice Thurgood Marshall, who later became Justice Thurgood Marshall, right? For Brown versus Board of Education, and what she said is that the business of oppression is not respecting one's personhood.
Ooh.
And
Can you say that again?
I will say it again. She said, the business of oppression is not respecting one's personhood. And so I would just really encourage everyone to think about the ways in which we may have been engaged in that kind of oppression by not respecting one's personhood, and also to be in support of this legislation and other types of legal reforms that absolutely try to dismantle this very systemic form of oppression. And really trying to ensure that everyone's personhood is respected.
That is amazing. Like, you have said a word. People are like, this is a quotable. We about to put it on the shirt. Because that is an amazing, right? Like, place to leave us and to be reflective of not only what we're experiencing, right? But how we show up and what we perpetuate in the world. So again, I would like to thank Senator McKinney in his office. Dominique Johnson is on, his legislative aide, who is a brilliant Black woman that is helping us in this space as well. Thank you for carrying this type of legislation. Thank you to Senator Kavanaugh, who introduced it last session, as well. And again, engage. The link is in the chat. So if you want to get engaged with what we're doing around LB 451, fill out the form to join the Curl Crew. You can also just get on our newsletter list. We will have a ton of call to actions that we send out each week, so we can stay engaged. We love you too, Dom. She says she loves us. I'm looking at the chat as it's coming up.
Yes.
So please engage, right? Because like we're a collective, and our goal is to really create space for our voices, and we want to work for Black women in Black community, right? So we take our direction from our community. We want to listen and be in partnership with our community. So please join this movement. Please help us get LB 451 to the finish line. And lastly, again, I can't say it enough. I just want to thank you, Dr. Green. You are so brilliant. You are so amazing. And you make this work so accessible when it can, like, when you think about all the legalese, and I just, my mind gets to spin, and you're like, nope, here's the path, and this is what this means. And so I appreciate you making this work accessible, for the time and energy that you put into building this type of space for advocacy, and just really, like you said, your scholarship transforming our communities, and we can't thank you enough. So we appreciate you for making time tonight and being here with us, and we're excited to keep this work going. So we're gonna keep chipping away at it. It won't be the last time that we see you, either on screen or in person in Nebraska, as we figure out safely how to do that.
Yes. Yes. It's been 30 years since I've been there, so got to get back.
Oh yeah, you gotta come back. You gotta you gotta come for Omaha Days or something when like all the black folks get together. We're gonna find some Juneteenth. We're gonna find something for you to do when you come once it's safe. So be prepared, y'all. We're gonna have a big Abby Black Girl something with Dr. Green.
Oh, awesome. I love it. I'm looking forward to it.
Okay, well, thank you again. Thank y'all for
Thank
tuning
you.
in tonight. And y'all have a good night and stay safe. And we will see you advocating for LB 451.
Yes, free the hair.
Free the hair.